We've already seen the basics of process costing. And the key about process costing, as you remember, is that we need some sort of average cost per unit. What we now want to look at is a situation where the process has both an opening balance and a closing balance. I suppose what we could call this is opening work in progress and closing work in progress. OWIP and CWIP. Now, if we have work in progress, the whole point about it is that it will not be complete. As such, when we look at the components that go into the output, remember we had materials plus conversion costs, maybe split into labour and overheads. If they are not wholly complete, how do we get our average cost per unit? Well, let's look at a simple example. Let's suggest we're looking at CWIP, closing work in progress. And we could say that we have 400 units, 100% complete, with regard to materials. This is often the case. The material input is often wholly complete on the basis that we introduce the material at the beginning of the process and then we apply conversion costs to it. And conversion costs are 60% complete. Well, okay, if we were trying to attach costs to these, and we want to get an average cost per unit, I think we can see that we effectively have less units of conversion costs. You see, the concept that we introduce here is something called an equivalent unit. And the equivalent unit is where we take the physical units and multiply by the percentage degree of completion. Very simply, in this example, if we were looking at the materials, we know that we have what? 400 physical units. And they are 100% complete with regard to material content. So we would get 400 equivalent units. That's not rocket science. But when we come to conversion costs, we have 400 units worth, but we've only done 60% of the work. That is equivalent to having 240 units of wholly completed units. So I suppose it's this second one that we have to pick up on. We are now able to equate the partially completed units at the end of the period to the wholly completed units that have been both started, finished, and sent on to the following process. So this is the way it works. If that's the case, all we have to remember is that we're getting our cost per unit. But now we have to talk about cost per equivalent unit. Well, okay, let's see how this works with a question. We'll have some information with regard to the opening work in progress. 100% complete with regard to material. 30% complete with conversion costs. Well, hold on a moment. What we're going to see is that we're going to have to do this in two ways. So we have to get a little bit more information as well. If we were to look at the cost, the direct material cost was $12,600 and the conversion costs were $970. If you wish, in total, we get $13,570. And the final piece of information, of course, is how many physical units. We have 3,000 units here. So, I've written this out specially so we can talk about it. If we were looking at opening work in progress, what we're suggesting here is that we've already done 100% of the materials on it. So we don't need any materials in this period. And we've already done 30% of the conversion costs on it. Therefore, we only need 70% during this period. What other information do we have? Costs during the period. Direct materials. 7,000 units, $28,000. And our conversion costs, $17,430. Remember, of course, when we look at conversion costs, we do not have units associated with them. Conversion costs simply convert the material input in units into material output in units. So we have an opening work in progress. We have costs associated with the process and also our input in material units. Finally, we have our closing work in progress. If we look at our closing work in progress, we have 2,000 units. 2,000 units, 100% complete with materials, and 60% complete with conversion costs. So we're almost there. We almost have a full question. We've understood a little bit about opening work in progress and a little bit about closing work in progress. I suppose what we're saying with CWIP here is that yes, they're fully completed during this period with regard to materials. And we've already got 60% of our conversion costs. We're only missing the other 40. The final piece of the jigsaw is that we are told the units completed are 8,000. Okay, one thing you may have noticed is that we don't have any of the complexity that we talked about before. Do you remember we talked about things like normal loss, an abnormal gain, these sort of ideas? Well, the whole issue with the questions is that your examiner will either examine to do with stock issues, CWIP or OWIP, or he will examine to do with losses. But we do not expect to see the two together. And that is one of the few saving graces of what we're doing here. Remember what we did previously in process costing. The first thing that we look at in process costing is what is happening to the units. Exactly the same idea arises now as before. And although I don't think it's going to be too difficult, this is always the first thing I would do. I can't be bothered to draw up our process account. I'm simply looking at what's coming in and what's going out. So what information were we given? Well, we were given opening work in progress. That's an effective input to this period. Secondly, we were told that we have introduced materials, 7,000, input to this period. Thirdly, we were told we had CWIP. Output. Output because we carry it forward from this period and into the next. Oh, and finally, we have our actual units completed. 8,000. To me, this is always a useful check. It ensures that we know what is going on and we haven't missed anything. As we look at this question, we can see that the numbers are really relatively straightforward. But don't worry, there is enough to come to excite us. The first thing I would like to do is say, well, look, how am I going to do this question? Because remember, all I want is some sort of cost per unit. Well, if that's the case, let's just look at the steps involved. The first thing I want to do is to establish the number of equivalent units. Effectively, I want to establish how much work has been achieved during the period. This shouldn't be too difficult. As we're going to see, there are two ways of dealing with this. Secondly, we want to look at the period costs. Again, the reason why I separate this out is that the period costs will depend on the method that we use. And of course, if we have the period costs and the equivalent units, we can get our cost per equivalent unit. And finally, if we have that, we are able to do an evaluation. And we would hope that out of the evaluation we'll drop the answer that you need during the exam. So, 4 steps. Now we want to consider the 2 different methodologies that we may use. Well, okay. The key associated with this area of process costing is how we treat the opening work in progress valuation. As I have already said, there are 2 methods. Something called the average method and something called the FIFO method. If we can understand this area, we can easily do these questions. You see, let's start with the average method. With the average method, we stand at the end of the period and look at all of the units that we have produced. We have 2 types of unit. We have the unit that has been produced and passed on to the following process, and the units that are still in closing stock, the CWIP. When we look at the average method, we do not consider where they come from. We simply embrace all of those units as though they were wholly worked during this period. Now that means if we look at the opening work in progress, we will include work on the opening work in progress from previous periods. So all we have to remember is this. When we look at our equivalent units, we include work done on OWIP from previous periods. And all we have to do here is be consistent. If we've included the work done on the opening work in progress from previous periods, it would make sense to also include the cost of that work done. So when we look at our period costs, we must add the cost of the OWIP from the previous period. So that's the deal. We want to be consistent. If we are consistent and include both the work done from the previous period and also the cost of that work done, this will give us an appropriate average. Shall we see how it works with regard to the numbers that we've already talked about? Let's look back at the information. When we looked at OWIP, what is the critical piece of information that we need when we are using the average method? Well, what we could say is that the information associated with the percentage degree of completion is not important. Because remember, we are going to include all of opening work in progress as though it were done during this period. The critical pieces of information are the value of that work done. Because what we must do is to add back that into the computation in order that we are comparing like with like. So, I told you that there were 4 steps. And the first step was that we wanted to look at equivalent units. We want to see how much work was done during the period. If we are to look at the number of equivalent units, what I want to start with is a column of the physical units. Remember, we've already checked the physical units before we do anything else. And when we look at the equivalent units, there are 2 components. We have materials and we have conversion costs. Please note, if the examiners gets very excited with this, we could have more than 2 components. Because, of course, the conversion costs could be separated into, well, if nothing else, labour and overheads. When we look at materials, I want to know the percentage degree of completion. And I want to know the number of equivalent units that arise. Likewise for conversion costs. This is a relatively nice example. All we do is list down the outputs. And remember, the whole point of the averaging method is that we don't care where the outputs come from, we include them all. So what we had were wholly completed units. Wholly completed units, I think we calculated to 8,000. Secondly, we had our closing work in progress, 2,000. A total here of 10,000 units. If we're looking at wholly completed units, we know that we've completed them and sent them to the following process. If that's the case, we would have to see that they are 100% complete with regard to both materials and conversion costs. Otherwise, we're going to get some complaints from the following process. 100% of 8,000 I can do. When we look at closing work in progress, we said it was 100% with regard to materials. Remember, that's quite normal. We introduce the materials often at the beginning of the process and then do something to them. As a result of that, we would expect them most of the time to be 100% complete, although they don't have to be if the examiner's playing games. When we look at conversion costs, this is the whole reason why we're doing it. We remember that the CWIP, the closing work in progress, was only 60% complete. So we end up with 2,000 equivalent units of materials and 1,200 equivalent units of conversion costs. A total of 10,000 and 9,200. Okay, now let's look at our costs. Remember what I said before. We have included the work done on the opening work in progress. If we are including the work done on the opening work in progress, we must also include the cost of that work done. Therefore, when we look at the costs, we have, first of all, our period costs. Our period costs were 28,000 for direct materials and 17,430 for the conversion costs. If we then add in the OWIP valuation, the cost of the work done on the OWIP from the previous period, we add 12,600 and 970. We total to 40,600 and 18,400. We now have our costs. We now have our output in the form of equivalent units. Calculating the cost per equivalent unit, 40,600 divided by 10,000 comes to what? 4.06? 18,400 divided by 9,200 comes to 2. Not bad. So we have a cost per equivalent unit in terms of materials and in terms of conversion costs. We could sum them if you wish and say that the unit cost is £6.06. That may be helpful. In essence, we've completed the question now because we've done all the tough stuff. It's all downhill from here on in. If that's the case, let's now just do the final parts. Remember, I wanted an evaluation. If you think back to my inputs and outputs working, we had 2 inputs and 2 outputs. When we're evaluating, we want to value those outputs, don't we? So, if we were to look at the wholly completed units, what do we know about our wholly completed units? Well, if you think about it, we know from up top that the wholly completed units have 8,000 equivalent units of material and 8,000 equivalent units of conversion costs. So, all we need to do is to multiply up. Because they're the same, we can multiply up by the total figure, can't we? We would say we have 8,000 equivalent units. We multiply by the cost per equivalent unit, 6.06. And that gives us 48,480. We have valued the units that are wholly completed and passed on to the following process. The other element, of course, is the CWIP, the closing work in progress. Of course, we know that there is a differing number of equivalent units for materials and conversion costs. So let's look at them separately. If we're looking at materials, we had 2,000 equivalent units. If we look at conversion costs, we had 1,200 equivalent units. I can see you don't believe me. Let's just check back. If we were to look at CWIP, 2,000 equivalent units and 1,200. All we want to do now is to multiply those by the cost per unit. We multiply the materials by 4.06 and we multiply the conversion costs by 2. 4.06 multiplied by 2,000 comes to 8,120. Conversion costs, 1,200 multiplied by 2, 2,400. We end up with 10,520. Now, I'm not very interested in going very further in this question because we've effectively done all the tough stuff. You could, of course, dump all these numbers in the process account and make sure it all balances. My thoughts are that the type of thing that your examiner will want to know will be that sort of number or that sort of number. So I would stop there and simply dump the number in the answer. Okay, I can understand you don't trust me. What a fine judge of character you are. If that's the case, let's look at the process account. If we were to focus on the process account, remember, we had some opening work in progress. We also had the material costs and the conversion costs during the period. Now, I could look at the units here. I'm not going to bother because we looked at inputs and outputs of units right at the very beginning. So all I'm going to do is to consider the valuation. If you think back, our OWIP valuation we can find if we hunt hard enough. OWIP valuation was this value here, 13,570. We also have the direct material and the conversion costs. So these are the numbers we're going to dump in as debits, as inputs, whatever you want to call them. We said our OWIP valuation was 13,570. We said materials were 28,000, and we said that the conversion costs were 17,430. Then we can look at the outputs. Of course, we have output to the following process. And we've already said that that comes to 48,480. In addition to that, we have our CWIP. And we valued CWIP, if we just look above, at 10,520. The moment of truth. Does it all add up? Well, the answer is, quite astonishingly, I think it does. We have 59,000 here and 59,000 here. And that is good reason to pat myself on the back. Let's be serious for a moment. We have dealt with process costing in a situation where we've had work in progress, and specifically we've been using the average method. The average method including OWIP work done from the previous period, and of course, if it includes the OWIP work done from the previous period, it must include the cost. What we're now going to do is to look at the alternative methodology. This is something called FIFO. Now maybe remembering back to what FIFO was as a valuation method will help us. You should know that FIFO means first in, first out. And so what we're doing here is assuming that the units that came in first are the units that pass out first. The reason why it is important when we look at process costing is this. When we look at the process and consider the outputs, we now wish to consider where they have come from. You see, first in to the process at the beginning of the period will be the opening work in progress. Given that we have the opening work in progress, we say that we process that first. Only once we've processed the OWIP can we then go on to looking at the other units. Now, when we look at equivalent units, We only want to include work done during this period. And if that's the case, remember when we looked at OWIP? OWIP is a situation where the work done in the previous period is now going to be ignored. We only wish to see the work done during this period. Only includes work done on OWIP to completion. Any work done in the previous period, we wholly ignore. Well, if that's the case, what about the costs from the previous period? Do we include them in our computation? Well, the answer is no. We can't include them in our computation. Or, be careful, we don't include them in our cost per equivalent unit computation. We only include current period costs in our cost per equivalent unit computation. So that's the deal. The examiner may give you average or may give you FIFO. I've tried to look for some sort of trend here. I can't see one. Please note, given that we have these rules, we are essentially going to do the same sort of thing as we did before. Let's go back to the question we previously had and now apply the FIFO rather than the average rules. If we look back at OWIP, what is now the critical issue with opening work in progress? Remember before, the critical issue was knowing the costs of the materials and conversion costs in order that we could add them in. But we don't want to do that now. The critical issue with FIFO is separating the work done in the previous period from the work done in this period. Therefore, the percentage degree of completion is what we need to know. Let's see how this works. So remember, what I'm trying to do here is to get some sort of inputs and outputs, a quick working and nothing more. The inputs we already know. We've got our OWIP, 3,000 units. And of course, we've got the material inputs during the period. We were told 7,000. But remember, we're looking at FIFO. And if we look at FIFO, we have to consider the order in which the units will be completed. The units that were already in place at the beginning of the period will be completed first. We separate those out. The OWIP completed. Once we've completed those, then we would complete further units, what we would describe as wholly completed units. These are units that are both started and finished during the period. Note, of course, we don't know the wholly completed units until we've established the other values. Finally, we have CWIP, and we know that CWIP is 2,000. We don't have any losses or anything of that nature to make life more entertaining, so all we have to do is to balance up 10,000 and 10,000. If that's the case, the wholly completed units, those units both started and finished during the period, will be 5,000. Great. So we've done the inputs and outputs. We've got a handle on what's going on. And what we're going to do is take these three components because they will form the basis of our equivalent unit computation. Let's move on. If we're looking at our equivalent units, Remember, we start with our physical units, and from them we establish the equivalent units. Separate, of course, for materials and conversion costs. Materials, we can look at the percentage degree of completion and the number of equivalent units. Conversion costs, the percentage degree of completion and the equivalent units. So, remember we have the inputs already. We know that we have opening work in progress completed. Then we have our wholly completed units. Those units both started and finished during the period. And finally, we have CWIP. The numbers: 3,000, 5,000 and 2,000. If you wish, you can total. I don't think it really matters. So we've got the number of physical units. The only thing that is different to what we've done before is how we are treating OWIP. If you remember, we only want work done during this period. And if we go back to the question, we know that the material content was already 100% complete. If that's the case, we need no more material. Conversion costs were already 30% complete. And if that's the case, we need what? 70% to completion? That's why we needed the percentages. So if we look at our OWIP completed, we need nothing in relation to materials during this period, and we need 70% of conversion costs. 0 equivalent units and 2,100 equivalent units. What about wholly completed units? Well, this shouldn't be too difficult. If we both start and finish them during the period, they must be fully completed during this period. 100 and 100. That's 5,000 equivalent units and 5,000 equivalent units. Finally, we have our CWIP. When we look at CWIP, we know that by the end of the period it was 100% complete with regard to material and 60% complete with regard to conversion costs. That's all the same as it was before. 2,000 equivalent units and 1,200 equivalent units. Therefore, we have a total of 7,000 equivalent units with regard to material and a total of 8,300 equivalent units with regard to conversion costs. We've done the equivalent unit working. Now we can move on and establish the costs. If we're considering the costs, which costs must we look at? Well, of course, we're only looking at the work done during the present period. And if we're only looking at the work done for this period, we only want the costs for this period as well. Simple as that. We said something like the costs were 28,000 during the period for materials and something like 17,430 for the conversion costs. Okay, if we have our costs there, we can divide the costs by the equivalent units to get the cost per equivalent unit. What have we got? Oh, that's nice. $4. And what have we got here? $2.1. You may notice that the costs are slightly different to the values that we made before. Well, it's not surprising. We've got a slightly different mix of equivalent units and cost base. But there's something similar, and you would sort of expect that because the majority of the costs have remained the same. Great. We've done the big bit. once we've got the cost per equivalent unit, we know we are on the downhill stretch, the easy bit. But there are just a couple of little tricks we've got to be aware of. Finally, we want to look at our evaluation. Shall we do the bits that we know and love first of all? If we were to look at our wholly completed units, we know that there were 5,000 of them in terms of both materials and conversion costs. So we can multiply by $6.1 the total amount, and that will give us 30,500. Secondly, we can look at our CWIP. We've done this before. In fact, the equivalent units, not surprisingly, are exactly the same. If we look at materials and conversion costs separately, we had 2,000 equivalent units of material and 1,200 equivalent units of conversion costs. We multiplied by $4 for material and $2.1 for conversion costs. 4 multiplied by 2, 8,000. 1,200 multiplied by 2.1, 2,520. So we have a valuation there of 10,520. I've done those two first because those are the two that we have essentially done before. We know about them. We can easily understand them. Now let's look at the OWIP completed. If we were to look back at our equivalent unit working, what we see here is that we have 2,100 equivalent units of conversion costs and no equivalent units of materials. So, when we value up our OWIP, we include those 2,100 units. Conversion costs, 2,100. And the cost per equivalent unit, what was it? 2.1. Okay, so what we got here, we look at our conversion costs. We have $4,410. Does that reflect the full cost of the OWIP completed? Well, the answer is, during this period, yes, it does. But what we have to remember, of course, is that there was work done and hence cost incurred during the previous period. And that has not yet been included. So, we're going to have to include that as an OWIP valuation. If you remember back to the numbers we had earlier, the OWIP valuation was 13,570. So we slot in 13,570 and we end up with 17,980. My final observation, given that we have now looked at FIFO and average methods, is during the exam you have to think very carefully what the examiner is asking you. Please look at the requirement carefully before you start doing computations. It is too easy in these sort of computations to do working after working after working, when maybe all the examiner wanted was an equivalent unit figure or a cost per equivalent unit figure. Always work directly to what the examiner is asking for.